It is back, folks. The U.S. will require negative COVID tests for travelers coming from China after more than half of a plane load of passengers from China to Italy tested positive for COVID. Does it work to require incoming travelers to test? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. NPR reports U.S. will require travelers from China to show negative COVID tests before flight. This will apply to travelers from China, Hong Kong, and Macau to show a negative COVID test before entering the United States. The CDC announced the measure yesterday. It will go into effect January 5 for all passengers over age 2. Passengers must show a negative PCR or monitored antigen test no more than 2 days before departure, whether it's a direct flight or whether you're coming from another country. If you go China, London, New York, you would still have to show such a test, even though, strictly speaking, your flight is coming into the U.S. from London. The monitored test must be overseen by a telehealth service. CDC is pointing to the surge in COVID cases in China and the, quote, lack of adequate and transparent epidemiological and viral genomic sequence data being reported from that country. Quote, reduced testing and case reporting in China and minimal sharing of viral genomic sequence data could delay the identification of new variants of concern if they arise. So there's a few different things that I think are important to talk about here. And one of the things that I want to just remind people when it comes to transparency from China, if you look right now at the official reports of data from China, since the start of the pandemic, we're talking 3 years, folks, China is officially reporting that they've had only 400,000 COVID cases and only 5,200 deaths. You would have to be living under a rock and suffering from serious confusion to believe that these numbers are even remotely connected to the reality of COVID in China. Another interesting thing, if you look at the official data, China is starting to report higher case numbers, but never more than 5,000 cases a day. And yet, they have not officially reported any deaths since May. So it is absolutely correct that the data we're getting from China is bogus. And if you look at just a little anecdote, The Hill reports nearly half of passengers from China to Milan have COVID. Look at this. Nearly half of the passengers on 2 recent flights to Milan from China tested positive. 38% of passengers on one flight and 52% of those on a second flight had COVID. There is no way that the entire country of China, with a population of, is it 1.3 billion at this point? 1.4 billion people. There's no way they have only 4,000 or 5,000 cases a day and no deaths. If half of 2 random flights from China to Italy are people who have COVID. Okay, so 100% it is correct to believe that there is a crazy amount of COVID coming out of China. Now, the question is, does requiring entry COVID tests work? The idea is you require people to test to come in. You identify people who should immediately go into quarantine, and hopefully you prevent the spread. Yes, I mean, the idea makes some sense. The difficulties are many. The supervised antigen tests. Remember, when I was in Spain last summer, my girlfriend and I did these supervised antigen tests where it's just a home test, but someone watches you do it. And my girlfriend got 2 false positives and she was negative. We ended up having to find a hospital on a Sunday, Catholic holiday in Spain, which I can tell you is very difficult to do. Get a PCR. Turned out she was negative. Those tests are not the most accurate, but not only are false positives a problem, false negatives, particularly in asymptomatic people, are a major, major problem. In fact, when I had COVID a few weeks ago, I was testing negative on those tests, even though I had COVID until, I don't even know, I guess day 3 of my symptoms. So the limitations are asymptomatic people often test negative on those tests. It's not a guarantee you're not infected. The fact that you can get the test 2 days before travel makes it particularly unhelpful. The incubation period of COVID, even though, if you look at the bell curve, most people start showing symptoms between 2 to 5 days after exposure. It can be up to 10 or even more days. So is that a reason not to do anything? No, but it is a reason why the technique may not be that effective. To be perfectly frank, The most effective part of requiring testing for people coming from China is it might dissuade people who are carrying the virus from even coming to the United States at all. But the real effectiveness of that policy is a question mark, I think, is the point. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything, doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned, but we have to be sort of realistic about that strategy. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know if your perspective is changing on sort of like your risk tolerance at this point. And of course, you immediately will get the debate over this will inevitably be what happens in the United States because it's happening now in China, versus it might not be. China has a very low level of immunity as a result of their zero COVID policy. And so it's not necessarily the case that what we see in China is going to happen in the United States. Remains to be seen. Make sure you're subscribed on YouTube, youtube.com/The David Pakman Show. We're going to take a quick break and be right back with so much more to start winding down 2022.